Good morning. Thanks very much for coming to this symposium on managing public finances, country perspectives and external support in a changing landscape. We're getting started a little bit late, and we have a relatively small, but we hope energetic group who wants to engage on these issues, and we have some people live streaming in, and hopefully we'll be able to get some kind of a conversation going. The symposium presents ongoing work on the management of public finances in developing countries supported by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and thanks to Gates for this work. There are three different institutions involved: NYU's International Development Group at the Wagner Graduate School of Public Service, the Innovations for Successful Societies at Princeton's Woodrow Wilson School, and the Public Finance and Institutions program at the Overseas Development Institute. We're just going to be covering some bits and pieces of this. There are some overlaps in the work, and that's why we decided to do the panel together, but there are also some differences, and the work is at different stages. So the NYU team convened a working group to consider options for improving the international architecture of PFM reform, particularly looking for ways, both from the country perspective and from the international institutions perspective, ways to open up new ideas and space, more choice, better evidence, and so forth. That was the focus of the group. The working group covered some familiar territory, but also, we think, made some inroads into things that we weren't particularly aware of and opened up some avenues for further work. ODI, which of course has a lot of experience in PFM, and many of you know them well, I think, has also been working on its own version of a retrospective of PFM, but particularly they're moving into doing more work on the link between PFM and service delivery, particularly with respect to the health sector. So in the first panel, we're going to hear about the NYU work and to some extent the Princeton work, and then representatives of the NYU working group are first going to present some of the perspectives that have emerged, seek reactions from other panelists who are sitting on the panel in the front, and then try to generate a discussion. The Princeton ISS team developed case studies of low and middle income countries that tried to either increase domestic revenue generation or improve their ability to link priorities to the budget process, and achieve some success in doing that. In each case, partner country practitioners consider what shaped the moment for reform, what they did, and the delivery challenges that they faced and had to try to overcome, as well as the results. So the second and third panels will introduce issues that emerge from these cases. Each begins with a short video overview and an interview with the practitioner featured in the case. And two people will then speak to the issues raised in the cases, and then it will be opened up to further discussion. The cases aim to enhance our understanding not only of solutions, but also of persistent challenges, and to create some space for thinking about training initiatives. And then finally, we're going to have a closing panel that assembles seasoned thinkers and professionals in public sector reform and development cooperation to reflect briefly on themes that have come up in the symposium, but also from their own experiences. The panelists will suggest practical proposals for advancing reforms to improve the management of public finances, and again, we hope to have a nice discussion. So on behalf of the partners, and let me thank them, of course, the Gates Foundation, my NYU colleagues, Jennifer Widener and the team at Princeton, and Mark Miller at the team on ODI. On their behalf, we thank you and those who are participating from afar for joining us today. We look forward to engaging with you and hearing about your own experiences and getting feedback on how to improve and use our own work and hopefully your own as well. So once again, thank you very much for coming. And I'm going to now turn immediately to the first panel, which Ed Hedger is going to moderate. And Ed, over to you.
Thank you very much, Paul. In one of the most flagrant abuses of moderators to date, I'm also going to present a presentation just to kick off and motivate the discussion on behalf of the working group. So my name is Edward Hedger, and I've been a member of this working group. It's a joint endeavour, and there are a number of names. You will have seen a draft paper, so this is very much a sort of representative presentation. A couple of words about the working group and the endeavour. This has been an 18-month inquiry into a set of questions about the state of the art, the state of thinking of international support for public finance. And it has dived into some issues, reflected on that, changed tack a few times, but really attempted to consult the international community, what we're going to come and describe in a minute as the PFM discipline, and to find out what some of the state of the issues are there. What the paper then attempts to do is not so much put forward a view from that group, but to reflect back a distillation of what some 80 to 100 people have told us about the state of evidence, the state of ideas, the state of thinking of international support for PFM. You will therefore observe a degree of messiness. There are contradictory views, divergent views, occasional sort of, constants of views, but that picture itself is rather interesting. And what we've attempted to do is draw a few strands from that to prompt a discussion. Just a word on country focus. You will, we think, recognise many of the issues as relevant or pertinent right across the income spectrum, from the poorest and most fragile through to advanced OECD countries. But we particularly think there's an interesting space here on low to emerging middle-income countries in that sort of space of transition around access to sources of finance, access to sources of advice. And so if you can sort of orientate your thinking about the suitability or the applicability of that sort of context. Let me start with, we phrase these as questions, but really the point is, what were the problems that we set out? Why did we embark upon this? We selected, or we sort of heard about 3 or 4 main areas that seem to be a sense of where could PFM do better? And the first is something on learning and accelerating that learning. The results record seems to be fine, but what could we do to get better faster in terms of international support for PFM? The second was the connection to downstream results. Read that as sort of service delivery, perhaps as a proxy for that. But what do we know about the extent to which these fiscal institutions that we are concerned about really matter for results downstream? The third question was trying to speak more deliberately to a set of sort of policy questions with ever greater urgency on matters such as climate change, mitigation, scaling up of infrastructure spending. We asked whether, or we posited the question, perhaps the problem, that PFM institutions are not yet good enough at helping get radical, rapid policy change on the sort of fiscal side or supporting that. And third, we posed a question with some deliberate provocation. What does PFM have to do with policy matters, and particularly distributional questions? As everyone is concerned with inequality, leaving on behind, what's the role of PFM as opposed to public finance and public finance policy there? So that was the setup piece. A couple of starting points here. You'll notice that we talk both about public finance and about PFM. We do that intentionally, and we attempt to make the argument that not only is there the well-established connection, but possibly we should be considering a stronger articulation or exploration of that connection. We noted that historically there seemed to be a sense of a neutrality of PFM and thus a sort of versatility to whatever policy emphasis you want to put. Fiscal machinery, a set of PFM foundations which are pertinent. But we asked whether that may be under stress and that needs to be re-examined. We then noted that PFM does, as with everything else, need to be speaking to the big grand challenges, the major issues and policy agendas of our time. And, of course, political factors are hugely dominant. we're looking at the international architecture, we're looking at assistance and supply. That doesn't in any way suggest that we understate or do not regard as dominantly important the role of political economy factors. The first thing we did, talking to you and many others like you, the people who work in and on PFM, was we tried to work out what are we talking about when we mean this group of experts. We use this phrase, the sort of discipline, and here we sort of construed 4 or 5 significant features of that. PFM is a particularly important agenda in development cooperation, not just for its own sake, but for all the fiduciary and financing concerns that cover other agendas. So we suggest there's something distinctive about it. Secondly, we said that it has, as a community, become perhaps peculiarly strong, trenched both on its subject matter content and the conventions, the people, the thinking around that, but also the professionalization of the discipline. And so there's something quite strong as a cadre, a tribe, a discipline of people, their tools, their methods, their mindset, their approaches. And that makes it powerful in terms of its ability to be effective, but also raises questions about how one affects change with that. We saw this and observed this to be translated through what here we describe as conventions, but this is the codification of practice through assessment frameworks, tools, measures, metrics. And we thought there was an especially strong sense of arguably normative approaches, increasingly qualified by problem orientation, but these two things running in parallel. A strong disciplinary sense of what is good practice, accompanied by a problem-oriented dialectic in terms of how one approaches it. And we found this an interesting combination that we thought is worthy of some exploration. So, our attempt to distill everything we heard came down into 3 areas. We've called them priorities because problems sounds a bit negative, but we think these are 3 areas that do require, we suggest, some attention. The first is how to accelerate improvement in external assistance for PFM. We noted a few points. There's a long, complex causal chain, and these sort of PFM conventions, these intermediate institutions, serve an essential purpose in trying to get a stepping stone into downstream results. So a lot of the focus has become on strengthening those mechanics of PFM itself. That has produced a pretty good evidence record. No one seemed to think there was anything disastrously bad in the state of PFM and its international support. But there are not many people who also wanted to say complacently that it's fine and that we can declare victory. There was a slightly obscure, a slightly difficult to interpret results record, which we are still really trying to get to the bottom of. We concluded from that perhaps the pace of learning, the role of evidence in feeding back into rapid improvement is slower. And from that, we asked the question of what might permit faster learning. And one of the things we explored was whether greater choice could be an ingredient of that. This is from governments accessing sources of assistance. And the second, what it would take to increase knowledge, data, evidence, and to make that more open source and accessible. So, problem 1, how to accelerate the pace of improvement. Problem 2, we know, or at least we think we know, that strengthening these conventions will result in better results. By here, we're talking predominantly about service delivery, but also regulatory functions, other important priorities of government. But curiously, that second step has not received much attention, and we don't know much, really, empirically, about how to connect PFM down to, for example, service delivery, results, health, education, infrastructure. We know some things, but perhaps not enough. We adopted this phrase that I think others of you have used and has written up about the sense of sort of middle-range propositions, of are there some intermediate steps, some intermediate functions about when public financial management works well, that moves one step closer towards reliability and predictability of resource flows, frontline service units being able to get the right mix of financial resources on time, feedback loops up the channel, those sorts of questions. And we reflected the fact that I think is quite clear in discipline that there is some emergent work, but not a lot of formal thinking on that. So we here came up with the suggestion, the feedback, that this needs some more exploration. Everything is rather locked down into this sense of certainty, or this perhaps arguably excessive sense of certainty about the intermediate steps. How can we start to experiment, innovate? How could we find better data, better evidence of what the connections are downstream? This suggested for us that one might need to ask challenging questions about whether the 45 assessment tools that now capture the state of the art and state of thinking are fit for purpose. Do they capture the right things in the right way? How do they get refreshed and how do they get renewed? Are they disproportionately used for comparative measurement purposes and not sufficiently used for exploratory, at the frontier, questioning, interrogation of practice, feedback loops? Have we got that emphasis wrong in our determination to measure rather than in our attempts to discover, experiment, innovate? And what would it take not to throw that all out, but to tilt the way we use, the way we change, the way we use this sort of phrase, the way we curate the PFM conventions? So that was the second suggested problem. Third problem is the most contentious one. The minute we put PFM and policy on the same slide, certain people didn't particularly want to continue that conversation. They felt this has been helpfully separated, and why does this working group want to mess around with mixing up policy questions and management questions? We noted that when it comes to either policy, directions, or downstream results, clearly institutional arrangements are absolutely essential and vital. The definitions that we've adopted for the purpose of this work speak deliberately to the role of fiscal institutions in supporting the process of policy making, the process of policy implementation. They provide the information, the rules, the processes that support and inform decision making. What we questioned was, and we, I should say, did not resolve this, we didn't conclude this, we present this as a question more than a proposition, that there may have been a little bit too much of modesty in the contribution that PFM has to offer here. And two things that struck us were, first of all, in the case of allocation and reallocation. Across all countries, there is an increasing pressure on issues like climate change or infrastructure or some of these sort of grand global challenges to, for example, reallocate expenditure, reallocate monetary resources faster, more urgently, more radically than before. And yet there is a management discipline that's really quite focused on stability, continuity, incrementalism, almost in its DNA. And we asked whether there is a fitness for purpose or whether those institutions are well served by that. It was a contentious discussion, different views, but there was an encouragement of us to include material. The other question that we raised was, in the fiscal policy debates, there is a lot of thinking, of course, about the balance between stabilization objectives and with that fiscal restraint and distribution objectives and the need to move quickly on socio-economic policy concerns. Here, the feedback we have from some people is that some of the policy bias may have caused a degree of favouring of fiscal institutions, which are really rather good at supporting a stabilization objective, a fiscal discipline, of that aggregate management function, but they may not have developed as well and in as sophisticated ways at helping governments that have decided and policymakers that want to focus more strongly on distribution questions. So we posed a question here about the relationship between partly the PFM systems, but more the discipline. PFM experts who are there to support with the institutional arrangements to provide the right information, the right analysis to help policymakers. And we asked, is the balance right here? For this one, we put it as provocatively as a problem. We invite agreement, disagreement, clarification, but it seemed to us a thoughtful discussion to have. So, to bring towards a conclusion, and then we'll ask the panel what they thought about this. We started with some quite radical proposals, and the sense was that those might be interesting, but they would be controversial, and they might not be feasible. So we came up with two, what we might call sort of modest nudges towards an improved direction of travel. These are draft. We'd invite feedback and how we can strengthen them. The first, in terms of better assistance, better technical cooperation assistance, or TA for PFM. Do we need something in terms of a different assessment tool that helps either governments or decision makers when looking at project design or technical assistance proposals, think about the evidence that justifies the approach that's taken and a stronger theory or commitment to how results will be disseminated. We felt that the way these are judged at the moment perhaps underweight the extent to which people explicitly think through why is this intervention likely to lead to the change that we think is needed, and what is the evidence that that might have worked elsewhere. The second one was how to improve the sharing of information data. This phrase of sort of data clubs is used to express confidential communities of practice who are committed to sharing what would otherwise be quite sensitive information on performance success, feedback, in order to actually create a more thoughtful, insightful sort of feedback loop of information and data sharing. The second on relation to downstream results, touched on already the sense of a strong at the frontier experimental collection of data on what works related to downstream ideas. Second one was then relationship to how does that feed back into changes or improving in PFM assessment frameworks and conventions. The third priority, we were much more tentative here. We suggested, this was a number of researchers involved, so of course more research required would be one of the recommendations. But here, some more research into whether the set of fiscal institutions is fit for purpose against the set of policy orientations and policy challenges. We noted, for example, when it comes to the role of budget institutions in supporting reallocation, the last major study appeared to be around 2005 and was particularly focused on OECD countries. Is there a space for looking at that sort of work? And continuing the debate, we thought was important. This community, which prided itself on a degree of confidence and certainty, was, as you say, strangely conflicted when it came to this idea of the relationship with policy. So how does one convene that sort of conversation, that sort of debate? And to conclude, in case this was the question that was the only one that's been troubling you for the last 15 minutes, who cares? Is there enough of a problem here? Some people certainly said, this group really shouldn't be wasting its time on this. This is settled science. We know what to do. There isn't a burning platform. This is a relatively strong success story. So how does one make a case for change if we accept that things are fine, but also need to be better? How do we motivate that? We took a view that we could say, well, these changes will occur anyway. There will be greater contestability competition, choices of supply, and governments will gradually become more assertive, and that will disrupt structurally what's happening. So we could just leave it at that. Or we could exploit the fact that actually there's another interpretation of this, which the PFM discipline has been really rather good at being progressive, proactive, innovative, but it has de facto deployed that in quite fixed institutional ways. What about if we channeled that energy for the PFM discipline to take the lead and not wait to be challenged, and ask the question, well, not only what could be done to accelerate improvement, to accelerate knowledge, to accelerate learning, but how do we tackle the final and the most significant question that's haunted every group, such as our working group, for the last 20 years of inquiry, is the institutional incentives that surround this in order to make the sorts of changes we're talking about. If we don't like the way that PFA is used, why is that? How does that change? If we don't like the nature of advice, if we think there is something not working, the institutional incentives from the main providers of assistance and let's be honest, the individual incentives associated with the discipline could be a little bit of a constraint. So what are the practical things that could be done to overcome that? I'll leave that slide up, and then, if I may, I'd like to quickly switch roles and turn back to moderating the panel. So thank you for bearing with me. Could I invite the panelists to join me at the front, and then we'll pose some of these questions to them and turn over to all of you. Thank you. Great. Thank you very much. So we now have about 55 minutes to interrogate this. And actually, I think it's a great size of group to do this and a fantastic panel. You'll see who everyone is, and you should recognize them. But we have Nick Manning, former World Bank official, part of the NYU working group. Florence Katiza-Bromley, Government of Uganda and IMF, among others. Carolina Renteria, Government of Colombia, World Bank, IMF, Marco Canjano, former IMF, and now with ODI as well. So a rich array of insight from the providers and conveners and the advisors. The first question I'd like to, if I may, go to Nick. You've been part of this long, and I think we described it, I think your words at one point were fascinating and occasionally painful inquiry over 18 months of exploring this. What did you find most surprising, most unexpected, most interesting about what the group concluded?
Is this working? Yes. Thanks, Ed, and I'm glad that you carefully chose which words of mine you wanted to repeat about the process of the working group. For me, it's been a really fascinating exercise. I mean, I'm not a sort of PFM hardcore, so I've been a sort of sympathetic observer of PFM coming from sort of, a different institutional area. So to get immersed in the details of this, I mean, it really has been quite intriguing. And I've just been making some notes. I mean, there are sort of several areas that really sort of caught my attention. One is that, as we all know, development in general is a field where the certainties are remarkably passionate. And I mean, that's obviously in sort of, somewhat in direct proportion to the lack of evidence that drives the field. But I mean, it's territory where there's a lot of deeply held positions, which it's very hard to work out, well, what's behind them and how might we challenge this? Because, as I say, the evidence base is fairly weak. So in our initial consultations, I felt that really we were going to be stuck forever in trying to navigate. It was more like looking for a sort of peace treaty than sort of, trying to find some sort of, analytic way through. But by the end, I felt, though, that there is something distinctive about the PFM field, and there is actually a remarkable sense of inquiry or curiosity that lurks behind a lot of the comments and the responses that we got. And there was something rather reassuring about that. A second point that struck me, and Ed, you referred to this, was the accumulation of assessment tools. And I mean, very distinctively within PFM. And I was sort of puzzled as to well, what's that all about, right? And we should acknowledge Jens and his team and their work in uncovering the mystery of these tools. And on the one hand, the consultations revealed this sort of undercurrent of chatter, of sort of concern that these things are sort of, unduly normative, they're being misused, that there's a sort of reductionism implicit in them, that it's, it's all coming down to just a sort of a checklist approach. But again, rather positively, by the sort of the end of our consultations, I realized that there was an aspect of these assessment tools that have been really sort of undersung or underpraised. Two things about that. One is that they provided a sort of a map of the conceptual territory, which is remarkably clear, right? You may or may not agree with it, but by and large, talking to the PFM specialists, then they knew what they were talking about. It was pretty evident what their mental map was. That's very different to other institutional domains, and the tools have been enormously helpful in doing that. The other aspect of the tools that had really struck me as our working group sort of wound its way through was that they offered a way, despite some of the sort of concern about the sort of normative nature of the sort of recommendations, the conventions as we've referred to them, they do offer a remarkable way of learning from practitioner experience in a way that we don't have access to in other institutional domains. So by the end, I was feeling, well, okay, yeah, there are some concerns about this sort of checklist approach, but actually, other issues within public sector performance, and my own background in HRM. I mean, the civil service management specialists would love to have the problems that the PFM tools are allegedly generating. So there's something remarkable about this accumulation of tools, despite some, obviously some lurking questions. Third point that struck me, and again, I'll be very brief here because Ed has referred to this, was just the fact that there is a PFM discipline within development. And I mean, there's a sort of nascent professional discipline here, which offers about the only counterweight to economics within development. No other field within our part of the development industry has really got the same coherence, the same sort of focus on a set of questions, the concepts and theories, the same stability of a body of staff. We did a survey of some of the PFM specialists within development agencies, and it's a relatively stable body of staff. I mean, many sort of, subgroups within it. But it is a very powerful and potentially quite a transformative force within development. A fourth point that hit me was about the debates on the market. And I was surprised in many ways, actually. I was surprised that there was quite a few proponents of a more market-based approach to the provision of technical assistance. And some of this was sort of born out of a sense of despair. We don't really know what else to do. For heaven's sake, if we just, we just let there be a market, it'll force successes and failures to the surface, and then the invisible hand will sort of guide us towards more effective TA interventions. The puzzle was that the opposition to that, those many respondents who were appalled at the idea, that their sort of initial response was all around the theme of coordination. Can't be a market because then we'll lose coordination. And it was slightly perplexing because there are sort of two broad problems with the market. One is, in many cases, many of the country cases that we looked at, then there wasn't a market. It would actually have to be created. That the market territory has been completely ceded typically to the bank and the fund, but to one, what would the market be, right? Yeah. So, and the other problem was that where there were many providers, then coordination really wasn't doing very much to keep them in their lanes. Now, the actual issues, the problems that we sort of identified within the market are far more to do with if something more like a sort of free market were created, then the perverse incentives that would creep in. I mean, that seemed to us to be a far stronger objection to a sort of nakedly market approach. Plus, of course, the implication that some separation of funding from TA would be necessary, and good luck in that. That's unlikely to happen in our lifetime. Then the final point that sort of struck me and was that, and Ed has sort of ended on this note, that we were asked to reflect on the architecture, but of course it did occur to us sort of fairly early on, there is no architect. So who are we making these points to? And Ed, I think, has reflected well the sort of the summary of our thinking about, well, all we can do is toss them out there and see who picks them up and runs with them. But one thought here, and this is a very sort of personal note, so I'm going to end on this, is that my professional life in development, I sort of grew up within development at a time when institutions and then increasingly politics were seen as the deepest point of entry to some of the key development puzzles. It wasn't always like that. Right. There's no reason to think that it always will be like that. So to make a sort of a rather sort of pained analogy, that I also grew up imagining that the post-war sort of consensus about sort of the welfare state and social safety nets in OECD countries was there forever, but of course it wasn't. Right. It turns out it was a temporary blip, and it's subject to all sorts of opposition. Well, I feel a similar point about the sort of the presumption that institutional reform really is the way into development. It might not be like this forever. We might go back to a world where sort of incentives for policy change are far stronger within the development industry, and the approach to institutional reform is just, well, let it follow. It'll happen as a consequence, right? Well, to my mind, but as I say, this is a very personal reflection, that should provide some urgency to the question of, well, if institutions are going to be your point of entry, you better find a bit more evidence that you really can do something with it.
Thank you very much. We'll get lots of contributions, but to sort of hold at least three provocative thoughts. One, views on markets versus coordination. Another on to whom are we appealing, the architect point. And third, is there something more precarious about the gains in the sort of institutional contribution to this than we realise, and what might we do about that? If I may, I'll just move conveniently round the panel to Florence. I'd like to pose the question that I'm sure is on many people's minds here. Isn't this all a bit supply-oriented? We're talking about architects and the global system, but this is advice to assistance to governments. You were part of the working group that have a long distinguished career before that in government. What from a senior government official in a finance ministry does one make of this discussion, these proposals, this work? How should we be considering that perspective?
Thank you very much, Ed, and good morning once again, colleagues who are here. Allow me to start by saying this is a very pertinent discussion for me. During the discussion and all the work we've been handling, I had an opportunity to reflect back when I was working in Ministry of Finance, Uganda, way back in the 80s, post-conflict. But also I have worked in some countries, Anglophone mainly. And this is what I have to share. This is what keeps on coming in my head and disturbing me, that we need to understand that PFM systems in our countries, when I say our countries, I mean low developing countries. And with due respect, I want to point out that I think there are patients with chronic diseases. So if we are going to start thinking about how to treat the chronic diseases, we have to be very careful and look at the issues which have undermined the understanding of the diseases and only dealing with the symptoms. Why am I saying so? Because for a long time, 20 years back, all the issues like budget credibility remain low. We are still asking ourselves, it's a shame, what is the role of PFM in service delivery? We should not be asking this question. We are still getting the ministers to appreciate what is fiscal responsibility, what is fiscal accountability, and hence the link between that with PFM. No, we should not be asking this. Because of this gap, we should be looking for the underlying issues of why the systems have remained weak. To me, they are patients with various ailments. And why aren't we making a step? So I just want to thank my fellow colleagues for two issues which have been raised, which I want to comment on. What is the better and first way of strengthening PFM? From my experience, and having told you that PFM is a patient with several diseases which are not understood the causes, we need to have a very good caretaker. We are missing a caretaker who understands. We are missing shared commitment that if we are to achieve the political commitments of development, PFM has got to be addressed. This is what we are missing. From the government point of view, we are missing shared commitment, shared objectives to drive, to guide, to advise on the implementation of development assistance, technical assistance in PFM in the right area. One would argue the caretaker doesn't know the problem, which is normally the case. We are looking at the symptoms. No one understands what will happen if you treat the kidney and give yourself an overdose. What will happen to the other organs? I think that's what we are missing. Many ministers, technical people don't understand the interconnectivity of the organs of that patient. If you treat one, what do you do with the other? If you are late in addressing the problem, what happens to the other issue? So I wish to recommend for consideration, this is the time that we get ministers and their political leaders or presidents to commit. Fiscal responsibility is very important. This is what we are talking about. Fiscal responsibility and accountability. This is what we are missing. If we are talking about fiscal responsibility, we are saying these are the fiscal targets. Collect so much revenue, borrow so much money, get so much grant, but use it to achieve the following results. and then let there be accountability on the funds which are being spent. It's not happening, we've just heard. Why isn't it happening? Because there is no fiscal and political accountability. That draws my happiness to the next issue of concern, which is, for a long time, issues of PFM have been separated from issues of service delivery and from issues of outcome accountability. Not only at national level, because when we were in government, when we started Poverty Eradication Action Plan, which caught fire like madness in all low developing countries, the question we had in mind, if we spend money, what would be the outcome and what would be the impact? That was the question. We had a lot of argument and discussion. Many, even development partners, came and told us, Ministry of Finance is not responsible for outcome and output. That is line ministries. Don't go into areas. So that created a silo for PFM to focus on processes. The same happens at international level. When we would discuss issues of the link value for money efficiency, and now I'm talking when I was a government official, IMF would say, we are not interested in outcome and efficiency. That's the concern of World Bank. World Bank is responsible for development. IMF, that was then. I know the situation has changed, but that was then, and I think it still lingers in our minds and the way we operate. So IMF would say, we are responsible for macroeconomic stability so that the line ministries and World Bank and FDB can be able to undertake their development and deliver the outcome. So it's only until we remove that demarcation, then we can get the donors to cooperate and understand the link. Lastly, I'm also very happy because while we were undertaking and providing technical assistance in the number of countries, I would argue with my colleagues who were my employers that the approach to PFM has a gap. You don't move from here and go and tell them to introduce cash management unit or start doing MTF without understanding why. It is good to improve the processes, put in place the laws and the procedures, but for what? But for what? In Uganda, way back in the early 2000s, we had consultants from Oxford Policy Management who came and asked us, why are you doing all these things? Oh, because we want a very good template to align resources. Or we want to ensure that the expenditure areas are gone. He said, no, first identify what the issues are. The fiscal management issues. That's what you need to find out. Those are the ones to drive the PFM agenda, not that you want activity-based budgeting or you want program-based budgeting. What is the problem? The problem is reallocation. So we sat with this team for 3 consecutive days. The issues then were supplementary, high levels of supplementary, domestic arrears, and underperformance of the development budget. He said, all of you, whether you are Treasury Department, whether you are macro fiscal, whether you are budget department, focus on what your role should be to deliver that. And I'm happy it's coming out very clearly that we need to link PFM to the broader fiscal issues. Lastly is the question on the market. It has been raised by Nick, but I also want to add on that development assistance, the way it is developed within agreements between bilateral arrangements between countries and also between the multilaterals, EU, World Bank, IMF. So there are guidelines which guide, sorry to use the same word, which guide on how you're going to recruit the TA and where the TA should come from and how it can be utilized. So this is another area. Marketing is very exciting, open. That is, if the caretaker of the patient understands what he wants, and then he can do due diligence. But it's within the context of cooperation arrangement. The Germans will assist you, but they would want to buy the machinery from their country or get you buy the machinery from their country, and they would want to send you a German advisor. What do you do? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Wonderful. I'll turn briskly now on to Marco, if I may, pick up some of these themes. We've talked a lot about the conventions, those sorts of matters. Has standardization gone too far? Are, if not the sets of frameworks and conventions themselves problematic, is the use an issue? Is there a misuse of this, as Nick would say, this distinctively strong field? You know, you've written and thought about this. I was going to quote you, but you said you don't necessarily want to be held to your previous publications. So we'll ask you thoughts on this.
Thank you for that, Ed. It's a bit of a leading question, so that the answer is yes. So, and just for the spirit of full disclosure, so I've been guilty in creating some of what is now the most popular diagnostic. I was a junior member when the first Fiscal Transparency Code was developed. I was part of the team. Fast forward 15 years later, I was behind the new edition of the code. I was behind the PIMA, and I've been on the various points in time in the PIFA steering committee. So guilty as charged, as they say. Now, each instrument is matrix. It's good for what they are. It's a matrix, as Nick said. Probably PFM is more advanced than others. You have a bit of a map. You have numbers, heat maps, score, rating, rankings, whatever. Now, the use or misuse that's been done of all these instruments is part of, again, a bit of the market. So we all respond to incentives. I guess it's human nature. And so institutions, and so is donors, and so countries. So we've created sort of almost erasing mentality, which is filtered down pretty much everything we do, whether we like it or we don't, or whether we accept it explicitly or we don't. To some extent, this matrix is almost sort of quoting, I think, from all Wim Wenders sort of movies, colonized our subconscious. And it's interesting that some of these came out in your presentation as well. We need to accelerate. Why? Is it a race? Is there a medal at the end if you're faster introducing your MTEP or not? I don't understand. It takes whatever it takes. Assuming you, as Florence has identified, you identify what the issues are, what the problems that you're really trying to address. Now, being low in a certain ranking may be construed as the problem. So fine with me. I've had just recently in 2 countries, and they clearly made, we want to be on the map. We want to be on the map of the OBI index. We want to be on the FT for the IMF. That is the problem of visibility, of credibility, legitimacy, whatever. If that is the problem, I may agree or disagree, but that's it. That's the way it has to be presented. Again, the matrix filters through the market in the way we react. So coordination doesn't work. Has worked very rarely in extreme situation. Number one, the field is becoming crowded. When I started in this business, there were only a handful of institutions. Now everybody is the PFM arena because they find their own agenda. They find their own buzzwords: transparency, participation, governance, corruption, you name it. And everybody all of a sudden is into, and they compete because the measure of their success in the end is whether they can disburse from the donor side. From institutions like my former employee, the IMF or the World Bank, careers are made whether you place a loan or you sell, quote unquote, some TA or you run some diagnostic. So these are all incentives that has to be clearly identified. Otherwise, if they're ignored, we pretend that actually we think we're doing well. Yes, we're doing well for ourselves, for our institution, but not necessarily. I would say sometimes also as a byproduct, we end up helping countries identify their problems and occasionally fix them. So again, that's something we should bear in mind. And in the process, again, because of this incentive, we created all these silos. The very definition of PFM has been evolving, something we wrote with colleagues at the IMF a few years back. And actually, we stole it from Alan Schick, if I may. We use this expression, it's kind of an umbrella definition, is ever evolving because the world is changing. So PFM has become a bit of a blurred concept. Discussing with Nick, the old HRM word, is that part of PFM or not? People argue, procurement should be in, procurement should be out. If revenue mobilization is in, is out. Institutions are designed and structured differently. My former employer, FAD, revenue mobilization is out of PFM because the way they're organized. In other institutions, it's not that the case. Governments don't operate on that basis, but we manage to reproduce the silo mentality within governments. And what again, always surprised when I see, again, I don't want to blame Ed, we all do the same mistakes, these PFM versus fiscal policies, which I kind of fail to understand. To me, PFM is always a means to an end. So we have to go back to sort of Musgrave in the end. This is what public finance is all about. It's kind of sort of amusing that, Musgrave in '59 said one of the basic functions of branches of government is about income redistribution. Then for 50 years we set that aside, and now it's coming back, as they say in the movies, with a vengeance. We realize actually, from a macro implication, more sort of narrowly defined to society as a whole, we have to worry again about income distribution, and with that gender, and with that environment, and so on and so forth. So again, we have to be a little bit careful in creating these silos, as also Florence sort of reminded just a few minutes ago. So going back to the basic questions, metrics are good for what? None of these metrics is perfect. They're all subject to biases, normative preferences, more or less explicitly defined. They use, again, it's part of the market. Now, unfortunately, I'm called frequently by countries to help them districate themselves and put together what they call PFM strategy, which is another aberration that has emerged in the last 20 years. Australia, New Zealand, UK never had a PFM strategy when they were introducing reforms that, by and large, were largely successful. Now, every country I go, they have this laundry list of things that are PIFA-driven or FTE-driven or whatever, whose ultimate objectives, in the end, is improve the score. So the problem is, as Florence was paraphrasing, you know what the problem is? You don't have an MTEF. And Mr. may look at you and say, are you for Mars? So I have an issue. And the other issue, which I also find always surprising, we managed to create another dichotomy between PFM and service delivery. PFM is the how you try to implement policies. If service delivery becomes another realm, I really become to question, what is PFM then? So we are creating, instead of being a means to an end, we create an end by itself. And many of these PFM reform strategies, they look like that. So the objective is to introduce an MF, to adopt accrual accounting, to have an IFMS, to do what? Again, so we have to be careful. These things are all connected. Similarly, and to conclude, we have created this fictitious distinction between the upstream and downstream, which I always fail to understand. So I think we need a more encompassing 360 view between policies and PFM, service delivery, and what have you, but keeping these things a little bit, making sure that these are slightly different things, trying to fulfill different purposes. Otherwise the risk is creating confusion and then fall in the trap that, as I said, that the metrics are going to drive our behavior instead of being an input in our analysis and discussion and judgment. So at that point, I can certainly see, and probably the Gates friends, they have the IT sort of brain power to do it. We might have an app that will say, do your PFM reform, you input the PFM, whatever, and you get your PFM reform strategy with all the benchmarks and the timeline and the sequences, and we will all be out of business, which may actually not be a bad result. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I'm going to carry on this same theme, and the group, I think it's fair to say, struggled with this, is where does one draw the line? On the one hand, an umbrella and everything relates to everything. On the other hand, the need to organise and distinguish. Your sense of this, the PFM and policy relationship and connection, and particularly from sort of in government, how do these look? And you've been a senior official in both planning and the finance ministry, so have seen these sorts of directions. So how do you think we should, and as the one person who has wasn't been involved in the working group at all, actually, you have the luxury of pure objectivity here. How would you help us understand this?
Good. Is this working? Yes. So thank you for the invitation, and I mean, I find fascinating all this discussion because I've been working on PFM, I think, all of my life, but when I moved from Colombia and came to Washington and started working back on PFM, I had never heard PFM. So when I was going to apply for a position, I was like, oh no, this doesn't work. And then I started reading what was it about. And I had been budget director, and I had been advisor to the Fiscal Council, and I had been director of the National Planning Department, which is being Minister of Planning. And then I know a little about all these things, but literally the PFM headline kind of took me out of my comfort zone. And I think the message I started to learn from that is there's a group of people who work on PFM and have very clear what PFM is about. You have the world of practitioners, which are doing budget, treasury, accounting, everything that PFM does. And I think there's room for better connectivity between the real world and the institutions who are working. And now I'm in the IMF. I did World Bank and did IMF. So my first message is, I think there's something on the language we use. And if we kind of deconstruct that language and we go back to the basics, what is it that ministries of finance or what is it that ministries of planning are supposed to do? And then how we support that. So that was kind of, I never forget that because I want to be away from just having slogans or names and just moving to understand. And I think something that has come very clearly here is the why. Why are we doing this? And I think one thing that has tangibly been mentioned, but it's very important, is who is in the driving seat? And in the driving seat, you need the public officials. You need the people who are responsible for having a budget. You need the people who are responsible for fiscal policy, for deficit numbers, for cash management, and, as has been mentioned, for service delivery. So we cannot forget that. And I guess I was lucky that when I joined the Ministry of Finance of Colombia was the worst fiscal crisis Colombia had had in 60 years, so it was the best school I could have, with the best training I could have, because we really had huge problems. And back then, since then, for me, there was no so clear distinction between fiscal target and fiscal policy. And I'll tell you why. Because we were doing a consolidation. I joined in April 1999. The deficit was going to be 2.6, and I was responsible of the projections. By December, it was 6.3, so it was 4% of GDP in 8 months. And then came what are you going to do? One of the reforms was changing the intergovernmental transfer system. A formula, Colombia happens to have it in the constitution, so a constitutional reform. Very clear, you need to reduce 1%, And I remember telling back to the fund team that was doing, not the TA team, but the one that's working on consolidation. Well, this is gonna be very tough because education and health are financed by this intergovernmental transfer system, and we have a target of full education and full health to every Colombian in the next number of years. We kept saying that, but that didn't really kind of resonate. Final day of the decision, all the tables, the numbers were more or less on the target, and then one person says from the IMF, but your expenditure in education and health is decreasing. I'm like, voila. We have been saying, so for me it was very clear that fiscal policy, expenditure in what you want to do, it's linked to your fiscal numbers and the way you do PFM. So, and I never forget that, and I do think, as has been mentioned, I don't see that clear dichotomy between PFM and fiscal policy. I think far forward in many, many, many years. Now in the fund, we are doing things that are completely linked. So I am on public financial management, but as was mentioned, there's revenue and administration, and there's tax policy. There's the MTRS, medium-term revenue strategy, puts together tax policy and tax administration. And the idea of this intervention, or the idea of this analysis is, okay, if I am a low-income country or a middle-income country, or even maybe an advanced economy, and this is what I need to invest, or this is what I need to spend on in order to achieve X or Y goals, this is how my tax policy and tax administration should help me to increase my revenue. So you see there, I see there at least a connection between PFM and fiscal policy. And if you go into the public financial management, the work we are currently focusing more on, I would mention two things we are doing. So the PIMA has been mentioned here, the Public Investment Management Assessment, which basically looks at what is your plan in terms of public investment, and then it's planning, allocation, and implementation. Allocation, you have to go into sectors. You don't do allocation on like a big, big number. No, you go into sectors and you understand what is in my strategy in terms of transportation, what is in my strategy in terms of health, of education. So looking at the cycle makes us link very clearly, I think, the PFM part and the public policy. What have we found? That you really need to strengthen the connection between finance planning and the sectors. That is key, that's something that is very, very important. And that is something that it's not organic, I think. Some countries, the other thing is you have to look this in the context of the whole institutional setting. Some countries are organized in a very collaborative or information flows, others not. You have to identify that. And the last example I would like to mention is spending reviews. We are working a lot on spending reviews, and that is very interesting because you are looking at spending review in the education sector, so you have people experts in education, but then you see how the money goes from the budget to the sector. And when you start to go down, it's very, very interesting. You cannot forget that many countries are decentralized. So when you are really doing service delivery, you at the end, if you are focusing just in the central government or the budget, you are missing totally the delivery side if it's a decentralized country. So bottom line is, as has been mentioned, we need to understand well our member countries, our clients. We need to do a big effort of not being in the general sphere and really, really understanding, but governments need to be able to say to us, no, that's not what I need. No, I'm not ready for that, and my priority is A, B, and C. I really love when somebody says no to me in a table. I'm always looking forward for somebody saying, no, this is very good for you, but this is not what we need. And I think that when you have those two ingredients, then you are more able to be successful.
Wonderful, thank you. Let me take this, wonderful, rich insights. So we want to take now sort of 10, 12 minutes like to sort of get a few reactions, then I'll come back for a very quick fire round at the end. I'm just connecting what we presented as a group and some of the things we've heard. Very interesting reactions on some of the following. Seems to be an argument for what we might sort of call purposeful PFM, just remembering the sort of the symbiosis of management with delivery and policy. And one can falsely distinguish them but over-conflate them, how to get that sort of purposefulness. Second thing, an interesting one about, it's not the metrics, it's the perverse incentives that cause this particular sort of race towards achieving them, which disempowers governments to say no. What do we think about that? And then there's a third one where my sense is we're about to conclude this panel exactly at the place where we began this working group. We despair of coordination, but we're deeply troubled by the idea of competition. What's the third thing that we're missing, or how do we deal with that? We will not settle this now. This will rage over lunch as well. But again, thoughts on these sort of questions would be incredibly helpful. We'll do around, if you could be sort of crisp, a bit vocative, and make a point maybe as much as ask a question. Mics will come to you, left or right, so just please raise a hand and I'll take a bundle of questions. If you see a hand, just pass the mic there, please.
Hello. I'm Jackie Coolidge, formerly with the World Bank.
You need to just press the button once. Should go green.
Hello? It's green.
Oh, there we are. Sorry.
Then shout.
Jackie Coolidge, formerly with the World Bank. Florence, I was, really interested in your analogy of the patient, and I think the need to try to help improve the balance, within the body. In the role of data and accountability for government officials, we know we can make good use of a lot of data, but we have also seen cases where you've got certain government officials, for whatever reason, actively sabotaging efforts to collect data. So, for example, fighting against a unique tax ID number for taxpayers that would allow for sharing of information across different, tax areas and so on. Actively fighting against this kind of thing, and I was wondering if you could share any insights about how to overcome that kind of battle.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to ask you to not answer it just yet, but we'll take a round. Thanks.
Hi, thanks Ed for the presentation and for the panel for the interesting comments. I'm Maya King from the Blavatnik School of Government, University of Oxford. Just two questions. You consulted lots of people, I understand, and I'd just like to hear about whether there's any heterogeneity in the feedback between the people from aid-receiving countries and the people from on the supply side, we say. And my other comment is just to encourage you to say the unsayable and not self-censor. I think that the value of this group is not just about finding consensus, but also identifying the disagreements. And I think there's lots of interesting radical proposals and talking about things, oh, well, that'll never happen. But I think it's still worth to talk about them and get them out there in the market for ideas and to try and get more debate about some quite radical proposals. Thanks.
Yeah, Dan Honig, Johns Hopkins SAIS. A couple questions. So first, I am unclear on whether it is good or bad that there's no architect in the system, right? So no architect means no central coordination. It also seems to me to augur towards greater bargaining power for the recipient country side. And in the same way, some losses, some competition, and some of the negative features of the market that Nick pointed to seem to me to be tightly related to a world in which bargaining power is shifting, right? Does that help us, if we think of this as a bargain, what's the right and for whom, right? Our country is different with regards to how we think that bargain should proceed. The second question, kind of the standard academic question, lots of references to the need for more information and evidence on things. I'd love some more understanding of where those of us on the academic side of the, of the universe of the tribe or whatnot should be focusing our efforts. What kind of specific data would be useful in helping resolve these concerns? Thanks.
Thank you. Anyone else want to come at this point? Yep, one along there. Sorry, come to the other side, I think.
Good morning, Andrew Lawson from Fiscus. Again, many thanks to the panel. I totally share the view, which I think all put across, that PFM has to be purposeful. And I share Marco's view as well, that we need to stop talking as if service delivery was something different from PFM. But if we ask the question why that has ever come up, I think a lot of it has to do with information. And within the three sort of classic objectives of PFM, fiscal discipline, strategic allocation of resources, and efficient service delivery, we always have much better information on fiscal discipline. So we know that the deficit is going from 2.6 to 6.3, and that the stock of debt is going, to 120% or whatever it might be. But we don't necessarily know how many children are dropping out of school, etc. But that asymmetry of information is not essential. I've done a number of public expenditure reviews in countries with very poor information, Sierra Leone, Ethiopia, Mozambique, and you can actually find data on performance, but it's just not consistently made public. And partly because of that, the focus of too many PFM practitioners ends up being on fiscal discipline. So I wonder if that's a view shared by others, and if we can do anything about that information issue. A second point is really about the market. I've recently started working in Puerto Rico, which is a rather interesting case in point. There, it's the market gone wild. There are a huge number of consulting companies. Some of them are commissioned by the Federal Oversight Management Board, in other words, by the US government. Some are commissioned by the Governor's Office. Others are commissioned by NGOs trying to do good work. And it's a mess, a complete mess. But the market is operating freely. And the problem there is, I think to use Florence's word, there is no caretaker. There's no supervisor of this market. So I think whilst coordination's not working, we need to go back to Douglas North and recognize that markets do need institutions. And so the question is, if we go to an institution, what's going to be the nature of that? And maybe that's a better way of thinking about the problem rather than saying, markets versus coordination. Thanks.
Does anyone else want to come in at this point, which may be the only point before coffee, given the time? Yeah, there we are.
Hi, I'm Mark Miller from ODI. Just three quick reflections. One around in the terms of measurement and norms and standards. I wonder if there is, whether you think there's any difference between a set of norms that can support, say, spending control and things like, let's say, promoting greater equity or promoting improved service delivery. What I mean by that is there's probably quite a limited set of technologies, say, for producing a set of timely banker accounts, but there might be more different ways that governments can think about kind of more far-reaching policy goals like improving services or redistribution. So that's one thing. A second thing is around, we talked a lot about, again, about service delivery and how a lot of kind of measurement is currently focused, I would say, on the centre of government, central systems. And I wonder whether there's opportunities to use things like surveys, the worldwide bureaucracy indicators, and things like this to get a better understanding of how systems are working differently across different government organisations. And the third thing, I was just to pick up on this point around, Nick, you talked about professionalisation and the benefits of kind of having a PFM profession in some senses. But I wonder whether that's also causing the issues that Carolina raised about language, that in the kind of drive to kind of develop this profession, it's almost developed its own language, and that perhaps hides things for government officials. So I wonder kind of how we challenge ourselves as a profession to make things more accessible.
Great. I'm going to take one more intervention from Paul, and just then put the panel on notice. We're running sort of close to time. I think we've got leave to go on 5 minutes, so I'm then going to ask.
Yes, in fact, that's what I was going to say. We were supposed to take a break, and I thought maybe we could go a bit over on this. We started a bit late, but because we are connecting to some people overseas on different time zones, we can't go too far off schedule. So what I would suggest is, Ed, maybe you could get the panel to make a final set of responses, and then we clip the coffee break a little bit. There'll be less time for networking and interaction and so forth, but if people could go up, have a coffee, whatever you want, and then come back rather quickly, that we stay to time. Is that okay with everyone?
Yeah, very
Okay.
good. So what I'm going to do is ask two things very briefly. Select one question that you'd like to make a response to, but then to pick up Maya's point, the essential unsayable thing that this report should indeed be saying. One each, please. You're also allowed to pick one thing you'd like to make a remark on, and everything else is brilliant questions, but they're for coffee break, which will encourage networking. So let's maybe go in, if we can, the order that we started, so that we maybe Nick first, and I will cut you off if Paul gives me a look that coffee is imperiled.
Okay, some
thing.
things. Well, some things that we shouldn't say. One is that the investment in this territory, this part of development, has been vast. What we know about what it's produced is disproportionately small to that investment, right? I mean, it's slightly startling. The other thing maybe that we shouldn't say is that isomorphism has had quite a bad press, and there might be some grounds for just rethinking some of the intrinsic knee-jerk opposition to it. On the just one thing I'll pick was I think Mark and I think Andrew made the point about sort of the institutional arrangements. The focus on, actually I think it was Andrew, yeah, the focus on aggregate discipline and come on, there's a lot more. The challenge there is that sort of heroic sort of savior type missions with public expenditure reviews that do a massive exercise to actually uncover something, some policy question, and offer some sort of short-term corrective. That's great, but that isn't institutionalization. I mean, the challenge for the PFM discipline is how to build those correctives in, and that's exactly the point about what's the linkage between the PFM types, right? And the policy issues, which we've agreed should be there, but the question is how to strengthen those linkages.
Thank you very much. France.
Thank you very much. Let me just comment on the issue raised by Marco, matrix versus incentive. I think the most important part is that when we are implementing these reforms, we forget about incentives. We get these prescriptions, we get the line ministries to implement them without giving them the incentives. And if we talk about we ourselves in Ministry of Finance, we always know what the problems are. So why should we have all these matrices which are for either budget support or program with the USAID, US Treasury, a program with DFID, and have these matrices without really understanding or being open? The issue is being open about the disease affecting the patient. This is what we are missing. From my experience, we all know these problems, and we know that probably the underlying disease for this patient is not necessarily something tangible. Why should we repeat ourselves fiscal targets in all documents, education targets in all documents, when we know what they are? And then you find out that even the information, talking about information provided, is not relevant, is not reliable, is never challenged, is never validated. But we do proudly say budget transparency. The issue is, let's understand what the issue is. Provide an incentive to avoid that big problem we are facing. And commit ourselves to address it. I don't want to say, but in most cases, it is corruption.
Thank you. Marco.
Maya, the unsayable, I would say, less is more. There's way too much money in this business. There's way too many experts, many of which are simply charlatans. And I wish these people were caught either by the institution that are basically paying them, or by the countries that are really getting crappy advice. So I don't know whether the report is going to say that. Now, since I'm part of the charlatans flying around the world, so clearly. Now, on the other various things, I'll be as quick as I can.
Just if you could pick one.
Yes. In data and information, this came out. Governments also, I mean, then don't look at recipient government as this idealistic, perfect world, and we fly in and we mess around. Governments are also organized in silos. Ministry of Finance are silos, and between Ministry of Finance and line ministry, executives and parliament, so on and so forth. To answer your question, my experience has always been, I would say 100% of the cases, you ask for information, the answer is, we don't have it. You start digging, almost neverly information is somewhere. It's not processed, it's not connected, it's not validated, but there's always much more information. What PFM, in my mind, and I take a very minimalistic view of this world, is really about producing information, as Florence just said, which is reliable and comprehensive and so on and so forth. In other words, this is behind a definition of fiscal transparency. So if PFM doesn't do that, you'll never be able to understand the costing of delivering services, the trade-offs between short and long term, and the options, and so on and so forth. That's really the bulk of what PFM system should do. Then, of course, there's a long list of other things that can do. But information, I mean, is essential, it's clear.
And anyone who's interested in the assessment tool to weed out the charlatans should ask Mark over coffee. Carolina, last panel word, please. Thoughts on, the unsayable and the one thing you'd like.
Well, I was
The
not
record
part.
to reflect.
I was not part of the working group on the unsayable, so I don't know what to say about that. But in terms of, I mean, as I was hearing is, where do we? I'm talking IMF and maybe World Bank. Where do we have to move in order to move the agenda and be more effective? I think I don't agree with a silo between PFM and fiscal policy. But I do think we really need to start working much more between ministries and finance and sectors, which is challenging because for us, our normal, natural counterpart is the Ministry of Finance. So that means we have to open our space to be able to reach out to the sectors. And that goes with the silos. Silos we have, silos governments have. But I also think if you are optimistic and positive, data revolution is happening, so we have to find a way in which, because before it's like what information you have through the IFMIS, if you have an IFMIS, or if not, you go to the sectors and try to understand what information is collected there and try then to match the information from the sector to the information in the Ministry of Finance. They will never match, but I think we have to start being, we tend to want accuracy in information. And I think the first thing we want to have is a clear picture of what's going on, so kind of dimensions or sizes, I think that's important. But I also think if we can move to understand all the data that it's now being generated, everything is being changed by the availability of data and the social media and social connections. I think there's a space there. I have no idea, but given that we are here with the Gates Foundation, I think that is something that it's important. How do we tackle that information that it's out there in the sectors and link it to the Ministry of Finance or budgeting? We do public financial management. Our core instrument is the budget. So we need to find ways on doing that, and I am sure we will find them.
Thank you so much. This has been excellent. Among other things, I've been sort of shortlisting alternative titles for the paper. Runner-up was PFM, A Discipline of Charlatans. But I think the winner from Carolina was PFM, never heard of it. So thank you very much also for encouraging us to be a little bit bolder in the proposal, which we will do with your subsequent indulgence about things that you turn out to disagree with. But let me say thank you very much to Nick, Florence, Carolina, Marco for superb contributions, and Paul and for sort of convening and pick the word, sort of shepherding us. And thank you all of you for coming and your participation. Please have coffee quickly, but stick around because there are some fabulous panels coming up from the Princeton Innovations panel work coming up soon. So a round of applause for the panel, please.